It was a typical Friday afternoon in the middle of downtown Eastbrook, Illinois. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, lazy shadows that stretched across the busy streets. People were hustling and bustling, rushing home after a long week, the usual chaos of city life pressing in from all sides. Horns honked, impatient drivers weaving in and out of lanes as pedestrians walked with their heads buried in their phones. On the corner, a hot dog vendor shouted, trying to grab the attention of someone passing by. It was the kind of day where life just seemed to move at a fast pace, and you couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. In the midst of all this, Malcolm Reeves, a sharp-dressed, 68-year-old man, was cruising down Main Street in his 2023 Mercedes S-Class. To the casual observer, he might have looked like just another guy with too much money, a flashy car trying to stand out in a crowd. But Malcolm wasn't just anybody who was a federal judge, someone who had spent decades in courtrooms, overseeing the justice system with precision and a deep understanding of the law. And today, his experience in the courtroom was about to be put to the test in a way he never imagined. As he made his way through the traffic, some passers-by gave him quick glances, the kind of stares that made Malcolm uncomfortable but weren't new to him. He'd lived his whole life with people assuming things about him based on how he looked, the color of his skin, or the car he drove. A group of teenagers whispered as he drove past, and an older couple muttered something about stolen cars. It wasn't anything new, it never was. But that didn't mean it didn't weigh on him. That didn't mean he didn't feel it. Just as he reached the intersection of Main and Elm, the calm was suddenly shattered by the flashing lights of a police car. Red and blue lights spun wildly behind him in the rearview mirror, the siren cutting through the noise of the city. A cold knot formed in his stomach, but he kept his hands steady on the wheel. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over, but something told him it wasn't going to be like the others. Malcolm signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, the tires of his car crunching slightly on the asphalt. The squad car behind him was an older model, the kind that had seen better days, with a grille scratched and worn from years of service. The officer that stepped out of the car was a man in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who seemed like he wanted to prove he was in control, even when he wasn't. He walked up to the car slowly, his boots heavy on the pavement, his uniform neat and crisply pressed, but his expression tight, his face flushed with some unspoken frustration. When the officer reached the window, he didn't knock. Instead, he tapped on the glass twice, hard. It wasn't a knock, it was a message, the kind of tap that said, "You're going to listen to me now." Hey, he said, his voice raised just enough to make sure it got attention. "Slow down there, black guy. Were you rushing off to in a car like this?" Malcolm didn't react. He just stared straight ahead, his expression calm, unreadable. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before. The officer wasn't interested in any real reason for the stove. He was looking for something else. Control. Power. Maybe even a way to make himself feel better about something. Malcolm rolled the window halfway down, his eyes locking with the officer's, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "Is there a reason I'm being pulled over, officer?" The officer leaned in, resting a hand on the window frame, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Yeah, there is. You're driving a $100,000 car like you stole it. You don't belong here, do you?" The officer's words were laced with contempt, as if he were trying to provoke Malcolm into a reaction. He wasn't looking for an explanation. He was looking for power. Malcolm didn't flinch. His heart rate stayed steady. He wasn't surprised by the officer's words, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. "I wasn't speeding. I wasn't swerving. You can check the traffic cameras at the last two lights if you'd like," he said, his voice calm but firm. The officer's eyes narrowed, clearly unsatisfied. "Your papers, license, and maybe a good explanation for why you're on my street looking like Wall Street just spat you out." Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't respond right away. He reached for his wallet slowly, deliberately, taking his time. He wasn't nervous, but his fingers curled around the leather of his wallet, a subtle sign of the tension rising inside of him. "I live 10 blocks from here. I'm coming back from work. You want to see my schedule too?" Malcolm said, handing over his ID, his eyes still locked on the officer. The officer took the ID, but he didn't glance at it. Instead, he sized Malcolm up like he was some kind of criminal, already deciding what he thought about the man in front of him. "You got jokes," the officer muttered, his voice low and mocking. And that's when the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a sharp shadow across the car. The tension thickened in the air, and Malcolm knew this wasn't just a simple traffic stop anymore. Something was about to go wrong. Malcolm waited, his mind already thinking ahead. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He knew how these situations could escalate if you didn't keep your cool. But the officer wasn't done. "You know," the officer said, voice quieter now. "I've seen a lot of people try to play it cool, dress sharp, talking soft. But that calm attitude, it doesn't fool me. Makes me more suspicious." Malcolm turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting the officer's gaze. He was still calm, but something in him told him that this was different. "If I committed a traffic violation, issue the citation. If not, I'd like to continue home," Malcolm said, his voice firm, almost resigned. The officer laughed, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, you want to do this by the book? That's adorable." He took a step back from the car, surveying the street. But then he leaned in again, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't give a damn about writing a ticket. What I care about, what matters to me, is how this situation ends. And right now, it ends with you giving me $5,000. Malcolm blinked. He didn't flinch. He didn't even show any signs of surprise. But his eyes narrowed, just slightly. $5,000, Malcolm repeated, his voice low. "You think I'm just going to hand you money?" The officer, unfazed, simply nodded. "Yeah, $5,000. You hand it over, and I drive away. You get to keep your nice car and your clean record. Nobody has to hear about this again." Malcolm's eyes grew sharper, colder. He wasn't angry, not yet. But disappointment settled deep in his chest, the kind that had come after years of dealing with this. The officer wasn't just breaking the law. He was trying to sell Malcolm's silence. "What you're doing is illegal, officer," Malcolm said, his voice calm but final. "You're not enforcing the law. You're trying to sell your silence." The officer's expression twisted into a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped back, his fingers twitching toward the baton on his hip. The crowd around them watched, some filming, others pretending not to see. Malcolm watched the officer's every move. His pulse quickened, but his breath stayed even. He wasn't afraid. He was disappointed. And then, without warning, the officer raised the baton and slammed it down onto the left headlight of Malcolm's car. The sound was sharp. Final glass exploded across the hood, the pavement littered with tiny shards. "Death," the officer said, breathing heavily. "That's what happens when you act like you're above the rules." People flinched. Some gasped. But no one stepped in. No one ever did. Malcolm didn't move. He closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them again, the calm had thickened into something harder. He looked at the shattered headlight, then back at the officer, who was standing with the baton in hand like a predator marking his territory. "You've added vandalism to your list of crimes," Malcolm said quietly, his voice steady. The officer stepped forward, anger twisting his face. "What was that?" "You heard me," Malcolm replied, still calm. "You're digging yourself into a hole, and you don't even realize how deep it's getting." The officer scoffed, clearly unbothered. But his posture had shifted, just a little. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're in a courtroom, don't you? That suit gives you some kind of protection? Let me tell you something. Out here, I make the rules." Malcolm turned his head slowly, narrowing his eyes. "Is that how you operate? You use your badge to intimidate, to extort?" The officer's face twitched, and for a brief moment, just a brief moment, doubt flashed in his eyes. But then he pushed it aside, as if he hadn't heard Malcolm's words. "You think you can talk to me like that? You think you're special just because you wear a suit?" The officer's voice dropped, lower now, full of venom. "You're about to find out what happens when you cross the wrong cop." Malcolm didn't respond right away. Instead, he just looked at the officer, his eyes steady. "You're going to regret this." The words weren't a threat. They were the truth, spoken with the calm certainty of someone who had seen it all before, someone who had dealt with men like the officer in boardrooms and courtrooms for decades. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a bluff. It was simply the truth. And the officer, despite all his bluster, knew it. The silence between them stretched, tense and thick. Finally, the officer stepped back, his eyes darting between Malcolm's face and the phone Malcolm had slowly begun to reach for. He didn't know who Malcolm was calling, but it didn't matter, because the call that was about to happen would change everything. Malcolm wasn't afraid anymore. He was done playing games. And so he dialed the number. When the phone rang, he kept his eyes on the officer, who was growing more uneasy with every passing second. Finally, the call was answered. "Frank," Malcolm said evenly, his voice calm, like he was speaking to a colleague. "It's Malcolm Reeves. I'm no injuries, but one of your officers, David Knox, just pulled me over, said I was speeding, then offered to let me go for $5,000 in cash. When I refused, he smashed my headlight." The voice on the other end of the line shifted, no longer calm, now full of concern. The officer was standing still now, a nervous twitch on his face, realizing who Malcolm was talking to. When the line clicked off, Malcolm looked at the officer again, his gaze hard. "I'm Judge Malcolm Reeves," he said slowly, clearly. "Federal District Court, Northern District of Illinois." The officer's face drained of color. He blinked, but no words came out. He looked at Malcolm, then back at the driver's license in his pocket, and the realization hit him like a truck. The officer didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, unsure of what came next. Malcolm didn't look at him anymore. He just sat there, his hands folded in his lap, waiting for the inevitable.